Russia, being the largest country in the world, is located in northern Europe. Since the 1500s, Russia has been ruled by the Tsars, or rulers of Russia. They would get their power from divine right, and would give their power down to their oldest son, but there were certain exceptions. Tsars were autocratic leaders and used feudal representative bodies. In 1775, however, the Tsars had their first major threat. Pugachev's rebellion was a series of popular revolts in Russia when Catherine II seized power. It was organized by Yemelyan Pugachev, an old lieutenant of the Russian Imperial Army. His main purpose was to end serfdom, and his leadership presented a challenge to Catherine II. He gained many low-class followers. His rebellions were known to be the largest peasant revolts in Russian history. His period of time began to start the Russian Revolution. In 1861, all serfs in Russia were freed, stimulated by Tsar II. However, its abolition was achieved on terms unfavorable to the peasants and served to increase revolutionary pressures. By the early 1900s, Russia had begun fighting in World War I. During that time, Russia lost many of its resources and factories began to go towards the war supplies. They were devastated during the Russo-Japanese War when their military lost many humiliating battles. This also angered civilians to protest against government work. From 1894 to 1917, Nicholas II was the Tsar of Russia. He had harsh measures in the policies and the resistance to change in flawed masses. In 1905, unarmed demonstrators marched to present a petition to the Tsar. Striking workers and families gathered at 6 Point St. Petersburg. As they approached the Tsar's winter palace, army pickets began firing at the crowd to disperse them. Chaos occurred and many were killed or injured. This gained bitterness toward him. Eventually, Tsar Nicholas abdicated his throne and stepped down as a leader, being the last Tsar. Two provisional governments, or temporary governments, were formed, which were the Reds and Whites. The Whites were led by Kerensky, who was for capitalism and democracy. As Prime Minister, Kerensky did not want a revolution and wanted to keep Russia fighting in the war. At this point, Soviets, or groups of soldiers, peasants, and workers, were aggravated with how they were being treated. The Reds see this time to take advantage of the situation. If Russia was going to have a revolution, then they had to have an articulate leader with a vision like Trotsky and Lenin. Leon Trotsky was a brilliant Marxist thinker, and Vladimir Lenin was known as the father of the revolution. His ideas of communism in earlier years had him exiled from society to Siberia. He was later sent to exile outside of Germany. When Germany heard about the possible revolution, they immediately sent him back to Russia, knowing that he could stop Russia from continuing in the war. Lenin and Trotsky were for communism, and the Soviets were too. The mass majority of Russia was made of this low-class, uneducated group, so they had these people on the Red side, while most of the big business people and richer society was for the Whites. Trotsky was able to turn the Red Army into an effective fighting force with his passionate speeches and roused soldiers to fight. They fought in many cities for control, such as Moscow, which is the capital and the brain of Russia. Eventually, Lenin's group of Bolsheviks, an elite revolutionary group of socialists, were able to gain and hold political power. Lenin becomes leader and starts his rule by ending the war with Germany to focus on communist Russia. This is when civil war between the Reds and Whites broke out, and the Reds' forces overthrew government without struggle, officially separating the Whites from government. Now in 1922, the USSR was formed. Lenin had many plans for communist Russia, such as eliminating religion, and gave land to Soviets. He found the new economic policy, which was a system of state capitalism that started the process of industrialization and recovery from the Civil War. He also became the leader of the Soviet Union, after it was formed from territories of the Russian Empire. With all of Lenin's physical debilitation, he suffered from 2 strokes. A second nearly paralyzed his entire right side of his body, and this forced him to withdraw from active politics. In March 1923, Lenin suffered his 3rd stroke that put him mute and bedridden until his death in January 1924. With Lenin dead, there was now a leader that needed to step up into his place. The 2 main people who were looked at to become ruler was Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Before Lenin's death, Lenin said Stalin was crude, rude, and untrustworthy. Lenin then wrote a testament, but Stalin was able to keep it from getting sent to the Congress, and eventually Trotsky was exiled from the Soviet Union. With Trotsky no longer a competitor, Stalin was able to come into power with most of the population not understanding what the future had to hold. Under Stalin's rule, he got rid of Lenin's new economic policy and placed it with his highly centralized command economy. This was a system in which government makes all economic decisions. He also turned to totalitarianism to rule Russia. Totalitarianism is a government that exerts total control of every aspect of citizens' private and public life. Stalin introduced the FYP, or the 5-year plan. This was to promote industrial growth to catch up with the industrialization of Western Europe. With Stalin's act of evil, he ordered all of the Ukrainian harvests to be sent to Russia because they were known as the breadbasket of Europe. Taking all their food followed the mass amounts of Ukrainian deaths from starvation. Millions of Ukrainians died in the outcome. To make sure the citizens didn't see what evil he was doing, he used art and religion to make himself look powerful and holy. He also started Russification, which was to make all the Soviet republics more Russia-like. Stalin used indoctrination in schools. This was teaching false things until eventually it was believed to be facts. However, he did allow education for all and created opportunities for women, since they weren't always given these equal rights. Stalin launched the Great Purge, which was a time when anyone expected to be disloyal Russians were captured and sent to Gulag or disappeared. Gulag was brutal labor camps. He used fear to keep people frightened and also used propaganda. For 26 years, Stalin had kept the USSR under his power, having some positive attributes to give his nation, but more evil. Over 20 million people were killed by Stalin, and some even say that Stalin put Russia back to where they started before the revolution.